I'm one of the Lord's Spiritual here in the Lord's, and last year I took on the role of Bishop to women's prisons. So it's wonderful to look around and see lots of familiar faces as well as those who I haven't yet met. As some of you may know, in the church's calendar, this week in October is always set aside to be marked as National Prisons Week. And it's a week when people across different churches, different denominations, focus and pray for prisoners, their families, victims of crime, the communities, those working in the criminal justice system, and of course the many people who are involved in caring for those affected by crime, not only on the inside but also on the outside in the wider community. So I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting this event today in National Prisons Week. I am passionate about how we engage with the issues of women offenders and those at risk of offending. I'm also passionate about the role of services in the community. And this afternoon is just a brief opportunity to reflect on the local impact of the still relatively new female offender strategy. My own interest in this flows not least from my experience in the Diocese of Gloucester, which has one of the country's 12 women prisons, HMP Eastwood Park, as well as having an absolutely outstanding women's centre run by the Nelson Trust, whose work is exemplary. I am biased, but it is exemplary, and it's great to see a number of people from the Nelson Trust here today. Most of you here will know that the number of women in prison is approximately 4,000. That's about 5% of the total prison population. We know that these women present a distinct set of needs, and their imprisonment has a significant impact on communities and societies as a whole, not least because of the impact very often on children and the long-term effects of that. This event was planned a long time ago in the hope that the government's long-awaited female offender strategy would be published. So I'm delighted it has been. I'm also delighted that it recognises the vulnerabilities and challenges of women in prison. And it builds on the superb work done by the noble Lady Baroness Corston. I'm sorry she can't be here today, but again I'd like to express my sincere thanks to her. For over 10 years, we have known that women's centres work. And this afternoon will allow us to hear a little from those supporting women in the community in different ways. We've got a number of speakers that each have 5 minutes. My phone is there. I'm going to be on the clock. They know that.
Women in Prison campaigns to radically reduce the women's prison population. Decades of evidence, has just been alluded to, demonstrates that prison doesn't work. It doesn't deliver justice, fails to reduce reoffending and increases trauma and harm to some of our most disadvantaged citizens. Many of whom that we work with in Women in Prison are victims of violence with experience of mental ill health, substance misuse and poverty, in prison for short periods, for low-level, non-violent offending. Our campaign is informed by the work that we do in prison and in women's centres in Woking, Manchester and Lambeth, and colleagues are going to speak about some of their work in a few minutes. The government's new strategy reflects many elements of the blueprint for change that Baroness Corston set out 11 years ago. It includes plans to end the plans to build new women's prisons and to invest in community alternatives to custody and diversion, alternatives to custody and diversion from the criminal justice system so that root causes can be tackled. Delivery of the strategy could mark the beginning of a long-term cross-party plan to secure a social justice victory and save millions in public money, and be a model for what could be achieved for men in prison. We're full of hope for the strategy, but there are 3 potential fatal flaws and opportunities to deliver it. The first is that the strategy is effectively unfunded. The few £100,000 per year for the next 2 years across the whole of England and Wales is widely considered to be pitiful. This is despite the fact that millions were dedicated to the building of new women's prisons before those plans were abandoned, and many more millions are likely to come from the sale of HMP Holloway, closed 2 years ago and now sitting empty. The direct costs of women in the criminal justice system largely fall to the MOJ and to policing, but funding needs to come from across government departments to reflect the causes and solutions of women's offending in terms of health and housing. Where women's centres and holistic services do exist, their model of funding is a mixed pot demonstrating entrepreneurial survival that is an example to the charity sector. But survival is really taking its toll, with reserves often at rock bottom, funding opportunities running out, and independent funders rightly losing patience with having to be a lifeline, especially for core funding. Staff are routinely put at risk of redundancy and services at risk of closure by a hand-to-mouth existence which passes on to the vulnerable people which we support. Opportunities to fill gaps from the likes of the tampon tax have not materialised, and the result is unstable and unsustainable funding for the very services alluded to that will deliver the strategy. Adequate funding must be found if this strategy is to have any hope of success. But it's not just about how much money, but it's about how we're going to spend it. So to opportunity number 2, or fatal flaw as it currently is, there's no strategic plan for how to invest the funds that do exist, or to build a national picture of what services exist for women. Where there are gaps, where funding is coming from and how long it will last. Of course this is the territory of easier said than done, we know this, but without it we will continue with a postcode lottery which at the moment is an affront to justice. Data shows that where a woman lives impacts directly on whether she receives a prison sentence or not, just as over the weekend there was coverage of a similar lottery in terms of babies taken into immediate care from birth. The stakes are high if we choose not to take the opportunity to up our national game in the provision of services to women with the most complex needs. So to the final, third opportunity before my time runs out. I'm not very good at obeying instructions. Whilst the end of plans to build new women's prisons have been broadly welcomed pretty much universally, there is real concern about a new focus on new facilities that may not solve the problem. At Women in Prison, we know more than most how important homelessness is in discussions about imprisonment, with shocking figures about the number of women leaving prison without a home to go to. If the focus in the strategy was on the housing first model and securing permanent housing solutions for women and their families, then we would be all for it. We know from our work in women's centres and prisons that what works in supporting women and men to turn their lives around is the ability to build relationships, connections and trust. The vast majority of women in prison reach there because they have been failed by the state. They have been failed either as children in care or as victims of domestic violence and sexual exploitation, or because they have been left to bring up their families in poverty. The Women's Centre model shows how trust can be built, relationships repaired and futures created. In numerous grassroots projects in communities and churches, relationships, love and trust are creating real change. What tackles root causes of offending is not institutions or buildings, however shiny and new, it's people. In Manchester, we have shown how you can reduce the prison population without new buildings. I hear my staff say you must be joking, given where we're based. What has worked is strong local networks, partnerships and relationships with women which focus on their assets, needs and the root causes that have taken down the wrong path. If we want to increase confidence of police and sentences in alternatives to prison, then we need to build on the model we have and that currently hangs by an increasingly thin thread. We need to lift it up, promote it and show how it works and how it could work even better and at scale. We could halve the women's prison population by the next decade if we just got on with that task. Now, Maya Angelou is author of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and she said, "I've found that you judge a woman by how she deals with three things: a rainy day, lost luggage and tangled Christmas tree lights." Well, working in this sector and with many of the women we work with, it does feel like we're in a permanently rainy day with our lost luggage and several sets of tangled lights. So what we are pleading with the Minister for is that the strategy be used to untangle what we've got and to build on it and to really create an international example which Baroness Corsten set out all those years ago. Thanks.
Our prison inreach team offer a holistic service to the women, beginning the relationship while the woman is still in prison. We currently have 4 workers but we have long waiting lists. We can't get through all the women who want to see us, even though we only target those who are coming back to Birmingham in the next few months. As Kate said, women's centres have complex funding structures made up of different mix of contracts, charitable trusts, individual donations, fundraising events, and sometimes social enterprises. It is a tangled web of Christmas lights. This means we can offer a richness of support to the women. Many through the gate pieces of work are funded by the big lottery, as ours is. This grant, welcome as they are, they come to an end, as ours will in December. We don't know how we're going to continue it. After transforming rehabilitation, the reality is that many charitable trusts have pulled their funding away from criminal justice, and especially prison work, as they do not wish to prop up or contribute to payment by results of for-profit organisations. Although TR was supposed to be able to include the voluntary sector, in reality the package areas alone precluded most charities. This, alongside the deepest cuts to domestic abuse and other local authority funded contracts, is seeing hundreds more applications to trusts from organisations who traditionally held local authority contracts. This is a major double whammy for the women's centres. There's no doubt that the amount of funding for through the gate work under the CRC contract is nowhere near enough to offer the sort of service that the women require. Most can only afford a mentor or very low-level, time-limited support from a paid worker. In our experience, the level of support that women need upon release, especially for those who serve short prison sentences, is very, very intense. Our workers often spend 2 to 3 weeks solid with one woman. Many times women are released with no accommodation, and even when it appears to be set up, sometimes it isn't. A few weeks ago, one of our workers, Ellie, met a young woman who was due to be released the following week. Her youth and extreme vulnerability made her want to pick her up from the gate, something we don't ordinarily do. The resettlement team had arranged accommodation for her. Ellie met her and drove her to the address she'd been given, only to find that it was an office. It didn't actually exist. They spent the next 2 days madly trying to find a temporary bed for the night and then a hostel. She'd been released from prison with £5 because she wasn't due the £48 discharge grant because she was on a recall. What would she have done had she not been supported by our worker? She stayed at 2 different hostels, one which is in absolute meltdown at the moment due to the cuts to supporting people. The manager is overwhelmed, has locked herself in the office. She's understaffed and the women are running riot. Drug abuse and bullying is out of control. While there, another housing provider came in and talked to the women about their hostel, and our young lady thought, oh, that'll be better, and moved herself there over the weekend. On the Monday, Ellie went to see her, and the place was rat infested and the standard of housing pretty unfit for human habitation. They're one of the few unscrupulous landlords receiving high rate housing benefit, saying that they offer supported accommodation. Fortunately, a bed became available at our shiny new residential Dawn House, and we were able to move her in. She's doing really well now, but we're struggling because Dawn House is full. We've only got 6 beds, and we're finding it extremely difficult to find suitable follow-on accommodation. So it's not the answer. These small units really on their own. Obviously, this level of support is not a viable model for all the women released from prison currently. So we need the strategy to be successful in its aim to reduce the prison population and cease the use of these extremely damaging short sentences, plus the hundreds of recalls which see women serving 2 weeks pointlessly, only to be released again with the same issues. We would urge the government to do as Scotland has and choose to only use prison for crimes demanding a 12-month or more sentence. Anything more minor is better dealt with in the community. We know that women engage better than men with community sentences, but they need to be robust and offer a range of support in all the areas of her life that she needs. One-stop women's centres are the best place to offer this. We can effectively support with parenting issues, safeguarding, housing, mental health, domestic abuse, sexual violence, and deal in depth with the complex trauma that the women have in their lives. This trauma is what's led the women into the criminal justice in the first place. We need early diversion schemes, robust alternatives to custody, and we need to reserve prison for those who really need to be supported within a confined space, which is only probably a few hundred women. This would lower the numbers to such an extent that good therapeutic interventions could be put in place, such as those in the personality disorder units, which are presently reserved for the few. There's a whole cohort of women who've been damaged over the years by the revolving door sentences. They are majorly chaotic, often sex working to survive, and are under the radar of most statutory support agencies. They've had their children removed and adopted, and they've been imprisoned and controlled, subjected to ASBOs and other things, but no one has thought to look at the reasons why they became entrenched in the first place. Let's not keep creating more of these damaged women. There's been a real change in police attitudes over the last couple of years, but the community options need to catch up. Short prison sentences don't work. We have more than enough evidence of this by now, and they're a complete waste of money.
Okay, thank you to my colleagues Kate and Joy for highlighting the crucial part the women's centres play in supporting women away from the criminal justice system. I particularly want to thank Bishop Rachel for holding this important event today and for being such a strong advocate for the women's centres. I know that we are very grateful for the support you have given us and how impactful this has been for the women who we work with, and also really inspirational and motivational to us as workers. I work for the Nelson Trust. We are a charity that provides residential treatment for people who have substance dependence, which includes a trauma-informed programme for women, and we also have women's centres in Gloucester, Swindon, and soon a women's centre in Bridgewater, Somerset. Like most women's centres, we have developed strong relationships in the local community with a variety of agencies, both statutory and voluntary, who we work with in order to ensure that women get the appropriate interventions at the right time to meet their needs. One of the most important relationships is with the Diocese of Gloucestershire and other local faith-based groups, such as One Church. The church and the women's centres have a common purpose: to serve the community, particularly those who experience inequality and multiple vulnerabilities. We practice similar principles in our work, such as love, compassion, hope and faith. On a day at work when I was feeling particularly overwhelmed with the stories of trauma and abuse that we hear from women in our service, a co-worker said to me, "Rose, we have to love them back to life." This has always stayed with me. And this is what we have to offer our women through the women's centres. Love for the women, offering them a compassionate service, holding hope for them at a time when they often feel hopeless, and faith that life can get better for them. Some of the ways the church has supported our women locally is through putting on regular pamper days, by providing good food and doing the women's hair, nails and giving them a massage. It says you're worth it. You deserve to feel good about yourself and who you are. The women love these days. It really means a lot to them to get some time out of their difficulties. And at Christmas, they make up gift packs for the women. It says, "We're thinking of you at this time. We hold you in mind." Like many other women's centres, we have volunteers from the church. Our volunteers are particularly involved in our outreach to women who are caught up in street-based prostitution to fund their addiction to drugs. The women often get involved in discussions with the volunteers about faith at a time when they are struggling to survive their own situations. It really means something to them that there are other women who care about them, and those relationships are immensely important. It is the caring relationship with a key individual which is often the catalyst to change for our women. We are grateful to the Diocese for the Women's Garden Day. They absolutely loved having your garden to themselves, along with the staff in the Women's Centre. It was a very special day. And you also opened up the garden for goat therapy for the women, provided by an organisation called Delilah's Umbrella, who work with people who have experienced trauma like our women.
They didn't eat the plant.
Again, this was absolutely brilliant for the women. Great experience. All of these experiences offered a reparative experience for the women through kindness, care, community, and on that occasion, goats. From our Gloucester Women's Centre, we run a scheme called Reunite, as does Anawim and a few other women's organisations nationally. If a mother is sentenced to prison for 6 months or more, her housing benefit will stop and she will lose her family home. Her children will go into the care of the local authority, or if possible, into the care of a family member. When a mother is released from prison, she is seen as a single person and therefore only eligible to single person accommodation as her children aren't in her care. Then she can't get her children back because she does not have suitable accommodation. Reunite exists to tackle this terrible catch-22 situation, and we're extremely grateful to Bishop Rachel and the Diocese of Gloucestershire for giving us the use of a house in Gloucester so that we are able to reunite mothers with their children on release from prison. The reunited families receive ongoing support from the Women's Centre and the accommodation from the diocese. Our aim is to support the family and help prevent the children from having the same experiences as their mothers. A woman currently in the house now was released from prison a year ago. She first went to live with her mother. Her relationship with her daughter at the time was really difficult due to their separation. Once they moved into the Bishop's house together, their relationship improved. Today, her life is so different. She has a good relationship with her daughter, she is working, and they're doing really well as a family. I asked a colleague of mine, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, what she would say about Bishop Rachel. She said that through our centres we work with some of the most invisible women in our society, and through her advocacy Bishop Rachel gives them a voice, and we are all listening here today. For those women, diversion away from the criminal justice system, support and healing from their experiences are not best served through short, disruptive, impact disproportionate prison sentences. We all know that the women's centres are more effective than prison at reducing reoffending, so let's divert and reinvest the money currently being spent to where it makes the most impact, to the women's centres based in our communities. Thank you.
Hi, I'm so glad that I wrote this down actually. So I'm here to talk about my lived experience and comment on what worked and what may have prevented me from being in the cycle of complex, chaotic consequences that had me bouncing from disastrous situation to another, from probation to mental health services, from community drug services to prison, domestic violent relationship to refuges, and yet struggling to get the full support I needed. I've read through the female offender strategy and feel excited that this is being implemented and a solution to prevent unnecessary offending behaviour. I'm a big advocate for positive systems change. Oh my God, I'm shaking so much. I started committing petty crime in my late teens, shoplifting mainly, as a way of feeding my addiction to drugs. I couldn't stop using. The help I was given was substitute prescribing, which just kept me in the cycle of addiction and crime. My crimes progressed, and as my habit grew, so by the time I went to prison in my late 30s, I was given an 18-month sentence for a multitude of serious offences. It's taken me until now, the last 2 years, to realise that I wasn't given the right support I needed to properly deal with my issues. There was no trauma-informed therapy, no specialised courses to deal with negative self-belief that I had and the dangerous behaviour. I never looked at my cycle of domestic violence or healing the wounds from having sex worked. I couldn't get mental health support until I dealt with my addiction, which all kept me locked in painful patterns of behaviour. I have been fortunate to have found Nelson Trust, as they have been the one and only women's service which offered proper trauma-informed community courses after the rehabilitation that I received, which enabled me to change and function well in society. I did courses specifically designed for women, helping women in recovery, pattern changing, which dealt with my relationships and beyond anger and violence, which is 3 examples of groups which contributed to me dealing with my problems root and branch, rather than just minimising harm. I have not needed to commit any crime in the last 2 years. I haven't caused any harm to society. My self-esteem and confidence has grown, and I can honestly say that doing things like this, being involved in lived experience groups, has all meant that my past can be used for some greater good. I wholeheartedly believe that more money given to effective therapeutic community services will help women like me change in a lifelong lasting way. I can guarantee that very few, if any, women or young people dream of growing up to be criminals addicted to drugs. I aspire to make movies, write books, and go on adventures. I am one of the fortunate ones who found help to reconnect with my dreams as a young girl. I wonder how my life would have been different if I'd have received earlier intervention and offered more effective community services. Thank you for inviting me to share my experience and allowing me to contribute in a small way to supporting strategies like this one and systems change.
Lisa, thank you. Really inspiring. I know how hard it is standing here talking to us, so thank you hugely for that. Without more ado, Edward Arga, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm not sure how anyone could follow that extraordinary and amazing speech, Lisa. And I've listened with great interest to all of the speeches today, but I have to say, and it's no reflection on anyone else, that's one of the most powerful I've ever heard. So thank you for that. And thank you, Bishop Rachel, for inviting me here today. As I learnt from my good friend and colleague, Caroline Spellman, when you invite someone, a minister or anyone, to something, no one says no to the Bishop. And that, I think, is a reflection on your passion and your commitment to this agenda. As the minister with responsibility for women in the justice system, I hugely value the support that all of your organisations provide to these often very vulnerable women in society. And there is a whole wealth of experience in this room today and a huge amount of passion and commitment. We heard that from Kate, from Joy, from Rose, from Lisa just now. But there are also others I know who are here, or in some cases can't be, but who have done a huge amount on this agenda. No event like this could, in fairness, pass without us again mentioning Jean Corston and her amazing work. There are others I know who are passionate about this agenda more broadly outside of this place, and I look at Lady Grosvenor for her work around this agenda, and colleagues in the House of Lords. And as I look at the back of the room, I can see the Baroness Chisholm and the Baroness Sater, a relatively new Baroness who in her maiden speech focused on this agenda and the depth of knowledge she brings to it. And as you know, in June this year we published our long-awaited female offender strategy, which is actually, although as the newly appointed minister about a week afterwards I got to do the launch, that is a tribute to the work of my friend and colleague Philip Lee, my predecessor, who is at the back of the room today. Thank you, Philip. That strategy saw the government shift its focus from custody to the community. It aims to improve outcomes for women at all points in the justice system by taking a gender and trauma-informed approach to addressing their often complex needs. And I know, having heard today and having met many of you, and I think very recently met with Kate to talk about this as well, you are only too aware of the high levels of mental health needs, experience of abuse, and all the other problems associated with vulnerability faced by so many women who end up in the justice system. And once in the system, there is a very clear disparity between the needs of men and women. We still live with a criminal justice system and a custodial system that is designed to reflect the 78,000, 79,000 adult male offenders and not the 4,000 or 5,000 female offenders, or indeed the 750, 900 young people who end up in our justice system. And it's quite right, we look at female offenders very specifically, as we do in this strategy. We know that in comparison to their male counterparts, women have increased risk of self-harm, high rates of domestic and sexual abuse, high rates of drug misuse and low self-esteem. And the research tells us that female prisoners are more likely than male prisoners to report having been taken into care, experienced abuse and witnessed violence in the home as a child. And mothers in prison are more likely to have been living with their children prior to custody, around 60% of women compared with about 45% of men in prison who have children. And I'll just give you a few statistics, most of which you will already know, I'm sure, very well. Almost 60% of female offenders have experienced domestic violence. In 2017, there were 2,093 self-harm incidents per 1,000 female prisoners. That is an horrific figure, nearly 5 times higher than the rate of 445 per 1,000 prisoners in the male estate. And there's also something to be said, as a number of previous speakers have alluded to, about the types of offence women commit, which are often low-level, non-violent crimes which receive short custodial sentences that leave little time for rehabilitation within custody, but are long enough to disrupt a life and break family links. Female Offenders Strategy therefore sets up the government's commitment to a new programme of work for female offenders, which is driven by our vision to see fewer women come into the criminal justice system. We want to intervene earlier before a woman has offended. We want to divert some women who commit low-level offences out of the criminal justice system and into support, which is the best solution for the individual and for society as a whole. And we want to see fewer women in custody, especially on those short-term sentences. I understand the damage and disruption such sentences can cause the lives of both the woman herself and her family. At the same time, as I alluded to earlier, we know that short sentences don't actually allow the time to undertake effective rehabilitation. It clearly makes sense to see a greater proportion of women managed successfully in the community. That means providing robust sentences that provide the holistic support necessary to change lives and reduce reoffending. And finally, there will always be some women for whom the nature of the crime means they do need to receive a custodial sentence. But for these, we want to ensure a custodial environment that enables rehabilitation and better delivers outcomes that work for female offenders. This means improving family ties. It also means providing better support for women on release to transition back into the community. We know that securing stable accommodation and educational employment is critical, along with the necessary support to manage and overcome other challenges and needs such as mental health problems and substance misuse. Now, I know that we cannot do this alone. I think it was Joy who highlighted that if we are to succeed, the whole of government, voluntary sector and other agencies need to work together to deliver this, because the NHS, local authorities play a key role in meeting health needs, in meeting that housing need that was highlighted as so essential. And that is alongside a huge number of voluntary sector organisations, including the women's centres about which we've been hearing, that provide invaluable support. A key theme to the strategy, therefore, is the need for a better joined-up partnership approach to addressing the needs of female offenders, both nationally and in local areas. We have already invested £1 million over 5 years to support local areas to develop multi-agency, whole-system approach models, and are keen to see more of these. By working together, local agencies can address a woman's needs more effectively, and in turn, produce better outcomes for the individual and for society. We will continue to share best practice, identify emerging evidence, and build the business case for WSA models to successfully improve those outcomes. We've illustrated our commitment to improving that cross-government and local partnership working by committing to publish a national concordat for female offenders by the end of this year. That concordat will enable government departments, national and local organisations to hold a shared commitment to supporting this vulnerable cohort. I hope that together we can establish partnerships based on a common understanding of best principles, of lessons learned and of successes as shown by organisations such as the Anawim and the Nelson Trusts. We hope to see many, many local organisations like the ones here today voluntarily adopt that concordat and actively implement the best practice principles it will outline. And we will be engaging with external stakeholders and organisations like yours from November and look forward to working with you on this. Now, across government, we are investing £5 million of funding between now and 2020 in the context of this strategy. But I hear the points that many of you have made in a typically courteous but forthright way today and in the meetings I have with you and will I continue to have. And we will continue to keep funding under review as we take that work forward. As part of our aim to divert women out of short custodial sentences, we have also committed to working with local and national partners to develop a residential women's centre pilot at least 5 sites across England and Wales. And it's with interest that we've observed the success, for example, of the Dawn House Residential Centre run by Anawim, and we aspire to provide the same high quality of services in future pilots. We do want to develop a robust evidence base about what will be effective, sustainable and scalable models for reducing those on short custodial sentences. And over the next few months, I will continue to undertake the engagement process with stakeholders and potential providers and partners to refine the design and delivery model for that pilot. We do consider that the availability of intensive residential support packages, both at the point of sentencing on release, alongside other services, is key to achieving the changes we want to see. I'm delighted that Lord Farmer has agreed to undertake an additional review on family ties, looking at how these can be improved for women both in custody and the community. We know that supporting and maintaining positive family relationships is an important factor in reducing reoffending and indeed to breaking any cycle of reoffending and ensuring that those children have the opportunity to grow up with their parent. Lord Farmer is expected to report his findings at the end of the year, and I look forward to reading them. The government is motivated to deliver the policies set out in our female offender strategy and remains, as I am personally, committed to focusing on evidence-driven change for the female offender cohort. It is a positive vision, a vision that seeks to reduce reoffending and serve the needs of society through our criminal justice system, as well as serving the needs of those women who come into contact with it. I look forward to working with all of you in helping to make that a reality, and I also am looking forward, I think early next year, to visiting the Nelson Trust, who I know the Bishop works so closely with and who we've heard from today, and again that is something that I was strongly encouraged to do by my friend Caroline. So I look forward to visiting you and learning more about your work and what works. I just want to close, having I think been given a little bit of indulgence by the Bishop in my time length, by saying thank you all to every one of you here today for what you have said, most importantly for what you do day in, day out to help improve the outcomes for this vulnerable cohort and for so actively engaging with the strategy. And my final thank you once again is Lisa. Thank you for everything you did and said today. It's a privilege to have you here with us. Thank you very much.